Inside of our function bodies, we've been using a special keyword called this. Sometimes it's called the thisArg to make it easier to pronounce. In the rest of this video, we'll look at what the thisArg can point to. To make it easier to inspect what the thisArg points to, I'll put a debugger statement right before it so that when we call our function, it will drop us into the console debugger on the right. So to start us off, the thisArg is going to usually be an object. And so this will be pointing to an object of some sort which will have properties. So you can think of this as being a variable that points to some object. So the next question is, well, what is the object? Let's look at a couple of examples. Let's create an empty object. I'll just call it host. And we'll assign one property inside of it, and we'll just call it greet. And greet value will just be the greet function that we just created. So this is a little bit of a strange syntax here, but what I'm trying to show you is that we have an object called host, and it has one property called greet, and the value is just the function that we created up here. Now over in the debugger, I'll bring up the console here, and what I want to do is, let's make sure that the object exists, and then we'll call the greet function on it. And that'll drop us right into our debugger, and let's take a look at what the thisArg points to. And notice that it points to the object on which we called the function. And so in this example, we have an object called host, and it has some properties on it. And then we call the greet function. And so this, inside of the greet function, will point to the host object itself. Now if I press play, it'll say hello undefined. Don't worry about the WebSocket error there, that's related to Meteor. But it says hello undefined because we don't have a name property defined on the host object. So I can fix that by simply going over to the host object and creating another property called name. I'll just give it a name of eventedMind. And now, when I call the greet method on host, it should say hello eventedMind when I press play past the debugger. I've commented out the host object code, and I want to show you what happens if we just call the greet function directly. And so in this case, we haven't specified any kind of host object. We're just calling the function directly. And when I press enter, if you look at the thisArg, it points to something called the global object. And in this case, that's window of the browser. And if we were running in Node.js, this would be a different object called the global object. This can be one of the more confusing aspects of JavaScript because we didn't specify an object here directly, and so it's not always intuitive that by default the thisArg will point to the global object or window in the browser. So you have to be a little bit careful about that. Now, if we use something called strict mode, which is telling the browser to use the next generation of JavaScript features and to tighten up some of the JavaScript rules, in that case, it will not default to the global object, and instead, this can be undefined. Let me show you. I've added this special directive at the top of our code file called useStrict, and notice it's a string. And what it tells the JavaScript runtime to do is to add some additional rules that are stricter than the typical JavaScript rules that we're used to. So in this case, if we don't specify a thisArg directly, then this will be undefined. And I can show you that in the console. We'll just go over here and call the greeting function without specifying any object. And now if you take a look at this over in the scope variables, you should notice that it points to undefined. And so if we try to call a function on undefined, we'll just get an error. And so it says it cannot read the property name of undefined. So how do we provide a thisArg explicitly? There's two functions that all JavaScript functions get on their prototypes. If I take a look at greet, we can expand into it and notice that it has some properties and then it inherits some methods from the function prototype. The two that we're going to look at are apply and call. Before we move on, also notice that I've used this window object explicitly here so that we can play with the greet function in the console. And that's because useStrict requires that we put this on some kind of an object. Okay, so what we're going to do now is to use the call and apply functions. I'll start off with calling the call method, and its first parameter is going to be the object that we want the thisArg to point to. Let's use the host object that we created above. So I'll uncomment out the host object, and let's get rid of the greet property. So the host object now has just one property called name, and what we're going to do is call the greet function with the host object passed as the first parameter. Okay, because I'm using strict mode here, it wants me to put this on the window object, so we'll do that. And this will drop us in the debugger, and notice that the thisArg points to our host object. Next, I'm going to get rid of this debugger statement, and let's add a named parameter to the greet function called greeting. Then instead of hard coding hello, we'll just print out the greeting that was passed in as a parameter. Down here, I'm going to assign this to a result variable and then print it out to the console so we can see it. When I press save, notice that it says undefined, evented_mind, and that's because I didn't pass in a parameter to this call function. To do that, I can just add another parameter here and pass it directly in. So we'll pass the thisArg as the first parameter, and in that case, it's this host object. And then as a second, we'll pass any additional parameters that we want. Now notice in the debug console, it says hello_evented_mind. And we could change that parameter to see the output change. We can pass as many parameters to the call function as we want, separated by commas. The second function we can use to set the thisArg is called apply. The only difference between apply and call is that apply takes an array of arguments or named parameters as its second parameter. So instead of passing one parameter at a time separated by commas, we pass an array of values. This can be useful when we don't know ahead of time what the parameters are going to be. And so instead of passing them one by one, we just pass an array with their values. For example, when we're passing along arguments from one function to another. But notice the result in the console is the same. It's calling the greet function, and it's setting the thisArg equal to the host object, and then passing in a set of parameters as an array. In this video, we looked at what the thisArg points to inside of a function body. Specifically, we looked at how the this keyword can be an object or it can be undefined if we're using strict mode. Then we looked at how we can use the call and apply methods of any function to pass our own thisArg as a first parameter. And that the only difference between apply and call is that apply takes an array of parameters as a second argument, and call takes a bunch of parameters specified by or delimited by commas.